happy birthday, Danny Samuels. Try to embarrass him as much as you can. I'm Sarah Whiting. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture at Rice University. And on behalf of the Rice Design Alliance, I welcome you here to the first lecture for the RDA Spring Lecture Series, New Orleans 5 Years After. RDA would like to thank the Museum of Fine Arts Houston for the use of this amazing auditorium. And I'd also like to thank tonight's pre-lecture reception sponsors, Cheryl and Louis Raspino. And please take a moment to look at the list of sponsors for tonight's lecture. The support of these people is really invaluable to the RDA. As a courtesy to our speaker and to everyone in the audience, please silence your cell phones. I always feel like, finally, I get to say that. So that means you're really important if you get to say that. And don't use flash photography, please. So this series will continue each Wednesday night through February 9th. And please note the future speakers on the slide. Following the series on March 9th, the RDA will present a civic forum where County Judge Ed Bennett and Galveston Mayor Joe Jaworski will discuss lessons learned in light of the 5-year anniversary of Katrina. RDA's spring programs continue in April with the annual architecture tour, Houses of Import, which will focus on out-of-town architects working in the Houston area, and the annual Sally Walsh Lecture featuring Dutch designer Petra Blaise, presented by the RDA, the Rice School of Architecture, and the Architecture Center Houston Foundation. For more information on all of RDA's future programs, please see their website at www.ricedesignalliance.org. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Douglas Brinkley. It took my introducing him here at the RDA for me to have an opportunity finally to meet Douglas Brinkley, but in fact he played a role in my wanting to come to Rice. His book, The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America, was published in July 2009, right when I was in negotiations with Rice. And he was all over the news immediately. And I thought, wow, that seems like an interesting place. There was a review in the Sunday New York Times which referred to the 940-page tome as having Rooseveltian energy, which is a sort of amazing idea that a book that big can have energy is sort of amazing. Being large-hearted, full of the vitality of its subject, and a palpable love for the landscape it describes. The Chicago Tribune named him America's new past master. In addition to garnering attention in the press, the book received the National Outdoor Book Award and the Green Prize for Sustainable Literature. I will note that I have it on my Kindle, which I think is appropriate for a Green Prize winner. Dr. Douglas Brinkley is a professor of history at Rice University and a fellow of history at Rice's Baker Institute. He's been invited here tonight because of his passionate and thorough book, The Great Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, and the Mississippi Gulf Coast, which chronicles with incredible and harrowing detail the days of Katrina, and it was published only 6 months after the storm. He'll be speaking to that book this evening. His most recent book, The Quiet World, Saving Alaska's Wilderness Kingdom 1879 to 1960, which is 592 pages, is hot off the press. It was actually released just yesterday, and copies will be available outside for signing after this talk, along with the book, The Great Deluge. Before coming to Rice, Dr. Brinkley was professor of history and director of the Roosevelt Center at Tulane. From 1994 to 2005, he was Stephen Ambrose Professor of History and Director of the Eisenhower Center for American Studies at the University of New Orleans. So you see that he has a strong personal link to the topic that he'll be speaking to. He's won numerous awards, has received several honorary doctorates despite his young age, and 5 of his books have been selected as New York Times Notable Books of the Year. And while past master, as decreed by the Chicago Tribune, he has a decidedly contemporary voice. He's a contributing editor to Vanity Fair, the Los Angeles Times Book Review, and a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Atlantic Monthly. New projects, and he's a man who's clearly never bored, include Silent Spring Revolution, John Kennedy, Rachel Carson, Stuart Udall, and the environmental movement from 1961 to 1964, and a biography of Walter Cronkite. So he keeps busy, and I can attest to the fact that his writing is passionate and really compelling, and the topics are quite extraordinary. So it's already been 5 years since Katrina, and the important issues that were raised then have not yet been fully addressed. The complications of federal, state, and municipal funding, support, and design of infrastructure, the stuff that seems invisible in cities but that keeps them working. Brinkley's book points out many of the problems that are only clear when put in a larger context that includes, in addition to design, questions of history, geography, economics, and politics. Another issue that is on the table that still needs to be addressed with Katrina and after is the issue of shrinking cities. It's a phenomenon that occurred in New Orleans already before Katrina, but was greatly exacerbated by the storm. Issues of housing and issues of our urban constituencies. His analysis reveals a class crisis in America that's racial and economic, but also ageist. Those who suffered the most in Katrina's aftermath, he points out, were the elderly, and in an ever-aging population across America that's likely to be a common refrain. Brinkley's rapidly written book, I would not say hastily, given that it is so carefully constructed and detailed, but there is something truly remarkable about it coming out in only half a year. His remarkable book did much to cut through the chaos of Katrina to hone our attention on these specific issues and more. The RDA deserves credit for recognizing that it's important to revisit these issues 5 years later to shed fresh energy on the questions and problems and to see whether the distance of those 5 years offers us any new insight. And I applaud them for starting off this series with a historian who can give a broad view to these questions. Welcome to the RDA.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Dean. She got everything correct, and in an age of Wikipedia and internet things, this is virtually impossible, because there's usually some little fragment of misinformation, but I would say flawless presentation, and thank you for introducing me. It's really great to be here, and in general to be in Houston, a city that I love dearly, and to be a faculty member at Rice. I teach 3 classes every fall at Rice: a history of the Cold War, history of the presidency, and U.S. conservation history. And I'm here to talk to you about New Orleans, which is unusual for a historian to write. But I did it out of passion and out of a great love for the great city of New Orleans. My wife, Ann, is with me tonight, sitting right here, and she's born and raised in New Orleans. 2 of my 3 children are born at Truro Hospital in New Orleans, and all of my wife's family still lives there. So we still consider the New Orleans home in many ways. Although we've come here to Houston and we spend time in Austin, and I travel a lot with CBS News, where I serve as a historian for the network. The love of that city is something that will stay with me forever. And I thought I'd begin today by just reminding us what Katrina was like, or August 29th, 2005. It's one of these gold star days in history. It's like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. Katrina ate up a lot of the national oxygen, and it has a lot of reasons for us to be concerned. It's not just about a day or a week. Always keep in mind when people talk in history about the Dust Bowl of Oklahoma and the Great Depressions, the Dust Bowl went on for 7 years. Just because a hurricane leaves a community doesn't mean you're not still living in Katrina, New Orleans right now. The healing process which has started is nowhere near complete, and it's going to take a very long time because the Hurricane Katrina did that kind of damage all throughout the Gulf South. I was teaching at Tulane on the Sunday when everybody was saying get out of town. And I have one really bad personal quality, and I am very antsy and can't stand traffic. And the thought of doing an evacuation, because we had evacuated with animals, and kids and boarding up the house. My wife and I had done it the previous year, and the storm never came. Missed us, dodged the bullet. And it was so awful, that kind of gridlock on I-10, that the thought of doing it again, and I also had a professional concern. If the storm missed, the next morning was going to be on August 29th, was the first day Tulane University's classes were starting. And I had the syllabus to do, and I thought, what if some students stay? So I decided to stay, but we thought we made a smart move. My wife's father, Jerry Goldman, is an architect. He's a ship architect, but who also built and designed a building in New Orleans called One River Place, which is right next to the Hilton on the riverside, if any of you go there. And they were out of town, and they live on the top floor of One River Place. So I did, and brought my kids and wife to do a vertical evacuation. Now, it all seemed wise, and in fact, when there were a few moments when Katrina hit that were quite awe-inspiring. Virtue, I have a book out on Alaska, and writing about wilderness and nature means a great deal to me, the outdoors life. And the late historian Stephen Ambrose and I once took we had a gig from National Geographic to go from the Gulf of Mexico, the Barrier Islands, in fact, Breton Island we went to, which just got hit by the BP spill. It was TR, Theodore Roosevelt's second wildlife refuge, just received damage from the spill. But we went from those barrier offshore islands in the Gulf all the way up the Mississippi River to Lake Itasca by helicopter, by steamboat. We hiked along it, but we did the entire length of the river for Geographic in honor of the 200th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase of Thomas Jefferson. Wonderful time. We had a great photographer from Geographic with us, and Steve and I did a book for National Geographic, Mississippi River and the Making of the Nation. Beautifully done with photography by just the best photographers you could imagine, showing people what the Mississippi River was like. So there we are on August 29th on the top floor of One River Place, looking down at the Mississippi River where it bends, where it gets the name Crescent City, the curve in the river. And to my shock, and actually awe-inspiring, breathless moment, went out on the balcony of this high-rise, and the Mississippi River was running backwards. The power of Katrina was pulling the river completely white-capped in the opposite direction. And if you ever want to question that if you want to have a spiritual moment, you want to feel the hand of God, it was beautiful in an odd way because of the power of weather. And then I snapped out of reverie and started noticing balconies were peeling off of the building. You know, across the river, the warehouse doors were being opened. The telephone poles, wires had snapped, and they were snapping like whips. And we had a dog that we had to take down named Maxie, and we'd go out to the front, and it would like blow the dog away. Yeah, the leash, literally, it was that strong. And the danger of flying debris, of signs, and you get a head injury from something like that. Many people got hurt and killed in Mississippi in particular from flying metal debris, which becomes like shrapnel. And Katrina lost all charm, and it became the worst, darkest, grimmest moment I've ever witnessed. I went from One River Place building after the storm started passing. I went to the French Quarter, and my first assessment was these old buildings held up pretty well. All the great iconic architecture in the French Quarter wasn't that damaged. Yes, shutters were down. Yes, there were car windows, or got something smashed the windshield. Yes, a couple storefront windows, but the quarter seemed pretty good. And I ventured down towards an area called Bywater because I knew during Hurricane Betsy in 1965 that's the area most prone towards flooding. And I ran into a cabal of police officers, and I did the proverbial, excuse me, officers, I was going to ask a question, and they all turned around and said, get the hell out of here, the levee breached, the industrial canal. We're going to be underwater in New Orleans. And I heard them loud and clear. I didn't need to hear their words. I saw the terror on their faces for what that was going to mean for the city, for themselves. So we went back, loaded into a car, and I said, we got to get out of here. We weathered the storm, Katrina and I, but we had young children. And so we took the road, River Road. One of the key things to always remember about Katrina is the Mississippi River levee never breached. It was built properly, so it's very important. It's Lake Pontchartrain levees, the industrial canal, not the Mississippi River. So if you clung to the river levee on a little road and you had to go around debris and all, you could get right out of town, which we did. I hopped on I-10 heading west to Houston. We made reservations at the Woodway Hyatt, which we were lucky. I knew somebody, we were able to get a room, etc. And I was on I-10 heading west towards Baton Rouge, and there was nobody on the highway. I felt like I was in an apocalypse movie. Got situated in the hotel, and then with a friend of mine went back to New Orleans using the press credential and started working rescue boats around Central City, which was terribly flooded. And I want to tell you, for a young person or a person my age, I have not been to war, but New Orleans was a war zone. And it was the first time in my life you saw bodies that were bloated and dead, corpses just floating. And nobody could save the dead because people wanted to save the living. The floodwaters had so swept through and flooded the city, and it was continuing to rise, that one of the great things that did occur was the people were worried about West Nile disease and all when you're having to deal with the flood situation due to mosquitoes. And other diseases, not just that one. And there's also an evolutionary answer to that. The entire waters, all the streets flooded in New Orleans were filled with dragonflies, which have an insatiable appetite for mosquitoes. And they hatch their eggs in time of flooding. And so in an odd way, at first it seemed weird because everywhere you look, there are just dragonflies everywhere. And it was incredibly surreal. But you recognize they were your ally. If you go to Salt Lake City to the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, you'll see they built a statue to the seagulls who ate locusts and saved their crop and allowed the Mormons to continue their religious odyssey in Utah. New Orleans needs to build a tower to these dragonflies. It really helped in a public health sense. But at that point, utter anarchy reigned in New Orleans. And let me tell you a few of the problems pre-New Orleans, and I tell you this because it will apply to you here in Houston in hurricane season, in Galveston and other coastal areas. First off, we had no hurricane evacuation signs. If you go to Miami or go to Florida, you'll see all these signs and routes. Nobody had ever properly organized Louisiana hurricane evacuation signs. Number two, we had a plan for what would happen. And the plan was that all of our city buses, because New Orleans is built, as you know, it's a below sea level city, so it's like a bowl. When a hurricane starts coming, it's up to the mayor, and a mayor of the city is your head of your emergency operations. The mayor is supposed to make sure those assets, those buses are parked above sea level, meaning the outskirts of town. So when a city starts flooding, they can come back in later and get people out. Instead, our Mayor Nagin of New Orleans left all the buses parked below sea level. They all drowned. And it literally, while the city was drowning and he was hiding on the top floor of a Hyatt hotel in New Orleans, he was asking people, where are the keys? Who's got the key? They didn't even have the keys to the bus. And I broke the story in the Great Deluge. Do you know why nobody moved the buses? Do you know why there were no keys? It wasn't out in the media a lot. There was a labor dispute, and bus drivers weren't going to pay work emergencies because their union contract didn't have it in there. So there was no clause. So if you were a bus driver that would have done emergency, you just got out of New Orleans and evacuated your family, you weren't going to work, but you had no contract to work in emergency. That's how unprepared we were on the buses there. The people who did it right in our state, and it was our U.S. Coast Guard, who in Katrina, a division of Homeland Security, did not lose a single asset. And they didn't lose a single helicopter or boat because the Coast Guard had created a command center out of Alexandria Louisiana. So when it looked like the blob was coming to hit New Orleans, the Coast Guard moved all of its assets into a kind of camp where they had food, beds for volunteers and all, to operate outside of the city and come in, do basket lifts out, get sleep, rotate shifts. They had organized properly for a disaster. The U.S. Coast Guard gets an A or an A minus. They probably didn't have enough helicopters, if you have to have a criticism, but they operated very well during that particular crisis. Another problem pre-New Orleans that was faced was a shelter. The Superdome became the shelter of last resort and a place to go. If you couldn't leave, you go to the Superdome. They had no food or so little provisions of food, water, triage. They had nothing there. You'd only be able to last a day or two, not a week. So there was no planning on how to do that. Incidentally, also, I interview in my book Tony Zimbato, who is a professional hurricane chaser for NBC News, who goes all over the world, Tony, and it's his first time he ever went to a city. He went into New Orleans, and usually if you go like hurricane coming towards, pick your city, Charleston, you go to Charleston hours before the storm when it's calm, and it's a ghost town. He went into New Orleans, and every hotel was sold out with people sleeping in the lobbies. Nobody evacuated the hotels. People were coming in to below sea level. Another factor you may not realize is that the Red Cross refused and refuses to operate in New Orleans and Key West because they're seen as bullseyes for so much disaster damage that they wouldn't they only would operate outside of the city. So people in need of Red Cross had no help. I can go on and on all of it. It is a complete it's a Murphy's Law on steroids, what happened in New Orleans. Everything that could go wrong happened. The police, and many of the problems were due to political corruption that took place for generations. You had one of the worst, if not the worst, police force in the United States. Cops that were being bribed. Many of the police took their rescue vehicles and just left. Ann and I, at the Starbucks by Woodway, down off of Allen Parkway down there, I went in once and saw a group of Houston police officers. This is, a week or so after that, were laughing. They had a competition here in Houston of the cops of photographs of all the New Orleans police cars that were parked at Wendy's or McDonald's that have come here to Houston instead of staying in Louisiana. The good news for you all in Houston is they couldn't believe that they did that. Meaning you may have a police force if you get hit here. There was zero political leadership. Something you need to know, in an emergency in the United States, your emergency operations center is it. If somehow right now there's a terrorist attack on Houston and mayhem hits or a blackout or the big hurricane comes up the channel here and creates a god-awful situation, Houston's mayor is in charge of running an emergency operations center. A representative from Homeland Security will come into that meeting. The chief of police is supposed to come, and it's sort of get to the emergency operations center immediately to do immediate coordination. In New Orleans, the mayor disappeared. And so we were lucky in a sense. An old military guy from Homeland Security ran the emergency operations with a mayor nowhere to be found who had been shell-shocked from what occurred. We had a rookie governor, Kathleen Blanco, in Baton Rouge, and she was awful on media. When you look like a deer in the headlights and you're trying to get resolved, it's not very helpful. People can feel whether there's leadership or not in a crisis. We didn't have any. Add to that the systematic and endemic crime in New Orleans. of people that stayed, and the second the city went dark, the amount of very nefarious activities that took place occurred, and there was nobody to be there to manage the Superdome, to manage the streets, to do triage, to run Red Cross. It was all a breakdown. What about Louisiana National Guard? They didn't move their assets from below sea level and went to Jackson Barracks on the Mississippi River, which is between Plaquemines Parish and the 9th Ward. It's right near the Battle of Chalmette of Andrew Jackson's famous battle. And the industrial canal breached, and Jackson Barracks got flooded, and the Louisiana National Guard spent its first day saving its own people. Meaning they were just trying to survive, let alone help citizens. Meanwhile, that Superdome went from 20,000 to 27,000. You had overflow, then took over a convention center. And then rumors went amok. Rapes, murder, people shooting at helicopters. Much of it all untrue. The media got some blame for reporting it. I've defended the media somewhat. Because the police commissioner took to the microphones Eddie Compass. And Eddie told me, I mean, with no mayor in charge, Eddie Compass sort of, came up and said, all the media there, and started answering questions. But he decided, since the police department's so dishonest in New Orleans, I'm never going to be accused for hiding anything, so I'm going to tell the world what's going on here in real time. The problem was his real time were conspiracy rumors. So he would come to the mic and say, well, 2 people I heard had been raped at the Superdome and this, and I heard that a helicopter was shot. None of it was true. But that created hysteria. Why hysteria? Because there were no buses. To get the buses in, you had to have a bus driver. Now, most of the bus drivers in Louisiana, but even out of state, for school buses, there are many women school drivers that didn't want to come in to a city with no electricity, dark, at night, and just load up with people by themselves when there's violence and being shot at. So not only do we have to find the bus, then you had to find a driver, then you had to find security for the driver, and this all ate up days of people suffering. There is a general rule in crisis for rescue and relief. There is a 48-hour window. If you do not get to people in 48 hours, you're going to lose unnecessary life. In New Orleans, people died without having respirators. They didn't have medicine that they needed that got washed away. People had heat stroke, dehydration rampant, on and on and on. Many people died that didn't need to die, but we failed as a society, state, federal, and local, on that 48-hour window. To be fair, the magnitude of the storm was huge. On the other hand, New Orleans, on the eve of Katrina, was the second after there were the big 3 of Homeland Security worries are terrorist bombing in New York, San Francisco earthquake, and the flooding of New Orleans due to breached levees. So we knew all of this. I can show you reports that almost predicted everything that happened, but people don't do anything about it because we're very hard pressed. We just are trying to run our life in Houston. Oh, I don't want to think about hurricane season now. And we don't do the preparations properly, many communities, until it is too late. The other group there that did a good job in something was Louisiana Fish and Wildlife, kept boats, conservation boats near there, and came in and started rescuing people. All sorts of dramas happened in New Orleans, but many of them are ones 5 years later the city's still coping with. How do you get control of crime? Why is New Orleans the murder capital? The FBI has ostensibly took over the police department of New Orleans, and they call it Baghdad. They had no idea how you create a culture of corruption. When everybody's used to bribes, kickbacks, payoffs, turn the other way, it became, just read Robert Penn Warren, look into the history of Huey Long. And that kind of Louisiana politics, it's quaint when you're watching a movie or reading a book, but when you see people dying due to politics of corruption, it isn't funny anymore. And that it's not something to just laugh about, oh, that's the way we do business down here. It's not the way to do business. The storm kind of exposed all of these ills that the city now is still trying to deal with. A major culprit of engineering, if you like, of design in New Orleans, and the seed of destruction took place seemingly innocently in the 1950s, Eisenhower America, when we're starting to revamp up some public works projects. And we did the St. Lawrence Seaway. We built interstate highway system in the United States, the Eisenhower Highway. In New Orleans, they had the idea that you could defeat Houston, be the #1 port, saltwater port, Gulf port, New Orleans, because you beat out Houston and beat out Mobile. And you do this by building this thing called Mr. Go, Mississippi River Gulf Outlet. Mississippi River Go, every biologist, conservationist, everybody had any knowledge said you do not kill wetlands, destroy an ecosystem, rip out all the cypress trees, and create a canal mixing salt water with fresh water in a straight run that was supposed to make a ship turn from the Gulf, go up the Industrial Canal, and turn New Orleans into this big port. So down in the lower Ninth Ward, they could destroy the Longshoremen's Union, so they could do cheap cargo shipping and destroy the union, not pay the African Americans a lot. So instead of 10 workers, now you have 1, and you destroy the union, then you can hire cheaper labor. And it was all designed to turn New Orleans into this big international port. It was supported by the newspaper of New Orleans, by the entire business community. It became a booster deal. And who was laughed about at it were the biologists that knew and were saying, you can't do this. It's not plausible. It's not about green. You're putting the entire city at risk by building a hurricane wind tunnel. Because the barrier islands, which had been eroded, and the dredging that's going on, the wetlands are disappearing in New Orleans. They've lost the size of wetlands in Louisiana, the size of the state of Connecticut. It is the biggest environmental disaster of coastal erosion due to the oil and gas industries and due to the shipping industries. And yet nobody wanted to believe the real science. Oh, that's inconvenient. Well, Mr. Go is closed. And Mr. Go is, boulders are boarding it up. It was an engineering disaster. And it cost lives. Right now, the Army Corps of Engineers has been able to escape lawsuits on the breached levees, but they are paying up the gazoo now off of Mr. Go because they never maintained it properly, and they've been busted on the maintaining of this waterway. Nobody now wants Mr. Go. And guys, this is a big problem. We've got to deal in this country with reality about where you live. You just can't believe in the power of engineering. I told you about that Mississippi River running backwards. Engineering and design only takes you so far, but you've got to work with the environment you're being given. You've got to pay heed to, there's a reason those wetlands served as a sponge. When the hurricanes would come, the barrier islands would take the brunt, and then it would hit the wetlands, and it was like a sponge protecting New Orleans. Every day now, the water, and each hurricane season, the next storm, it's less wetlands, and it's going to keep hitting these 300 miles of levee systems with a direct impact, because they were constructed with the thought of the wetlands as a barrier. And so the city is a city still in peril in New Orleans. Nothing has changed to improve it. What has improved is that you have a tale of two cities, above sea level New Orleans and below sea level New Orleans. Good news, above sea level New Orleans. French Quarter, Garden District, where Ann and I were at, up around all the tourist area. You can make it, it's a bubble, it's the historic community, and it's high enough above sea level that it's not going to have continual flooding issues of a severe magnitude. Below sea level, Ninth Ward, New Orleans East, Gentilly, Lakefront, it's very, very dangerous. And it's one of so how do we deal with this as a policy? What do we do with New Orleans? I feel that our country did a disservice to the people who were victims of the storm in this particular regard. You had the diaspora, largest displacement of people since the Civil War. Many came here to Houston, and the city embraced them wholeheartedly. Mayor Bill White did a good job, and I, in my book, talk about all of the people. Democrat, Republicans, Texas stepped up during Katrina in a very real way, and the state showed what it can do. And it's meaningful what Texas did. But we're in a situation now in the below sea level, the Bush policy of George W. Bush, and continuing to be our government policy has been, we don't want to tell largely African American populations not to come back. That sounds pretty awful. So the official policy is, hey, you want to come back to the lower ninth? Hey, come back. The lower Ninth Ward, a largely African American community, is where Brad Pitt's architecture project, Make It Right, is located. That is about, was 60-some%, I think it was 67% homeowners, okay? Homeowners, 67%. So imagine you live there in a home, you evacuated, your neighborhood gets flooded because of the Mississippi River and Mississippi River Gulf outlet, breaching, flooding. You've got swamped. Water recedes. You want to come back to your house, and people say, "Well, come back. We're not stopping you. We're not going to have schools for you. We're not going to have garbage pickup. We're not going to have electricity. You know, you're not going to have any grocery stores or so. But come on back. It's your decision." As if community doesn't matter. And it's only due to groups like Common Ground and Brad Pitt's Make It Right, some people that started coming back to those neighborhoods, individual nonprofit groups and volunteerism, that's giving those communities any viability. Because the decision was to downsize New Orleans, let those people put the burden on the victim. And so obviously they stayed in Houston or Atlanta or Denver. How do you come back if you got kids to a neighborhood with no services, in a neighborhood that banks won't give you a loan, in a neighborhood that insurance won't, they no longer will cover you if you live in the neighborhood? So it's the death of those below sea level neighborhoods, and that was in many people's mind the heart and soul of New Orleans. It's where the working people lived. It was where the poor people lived. It tended to be traditionally African American because the whites of New Orleans would live on the above sea level part, the high ground, and the poor people would live on the flats. So the burden that's hit the African American community of New Orleans is really quite real and very intense. What about racism in New Orleans? Well, I mean, what was that during Katrina? What occurred was when you have largely 27,000 African Americans in the Superdome and another 20 in the convention center, and you have no buses, and you have and there are all these reports of violence, there was a slowness on the part of going in out of a fear factor. Do I think it was a racism with a capital R? No. Was there feeling of 5 black teenagers as a gang, 5 white teenagers aren't? There was some of that. I interviewed a woman who was very brave from Lake Charles, Louisiana, who went in big heart. She created the Lake Charles Flotilla. They organized at Lake Charles and took all these boats in, went into a largely black neighborhood, New Orleans East, and started rescuing. But she saw a group of African Americans breaking into a drugstore, carrying out like bags like Santa Claus. And she said to me, I thought I'm here. A liberal white from Lake Charles coming into a black neighborhood, organizing boats, and these kids, these young black men are stealing radios and TVs. That was what her mind said. Oh God, it's so awful. Well, let's start doing our Good Samaritan with them. Later, They went into a top of a senior citizen's home, and they ran into those kids. They had been keeping a whole group of elderly people alive, stealing provisions from the drugstore. And she had an epiphany about her own prejudice. And she said to me, you know, I'm like this liberal. And I can't believe that when second I see 5 African Americans, if I saw 5 white kids in a drugstore, I wouldn't think they're looting. I would have a different view. But when they're 5 black men, they're definitely criminals. And then they were saving old white people that had been left by a healthcare center, bad high-rise healthcare center that abandoned them. And she said, I'll never again prejudge people in an emergency. That people that were taking things to survive. Were there bad operators? Of course there were. But most people that stayed were trying to save each other and help people. The number of the really bad people were very minimal. And another guy I interviewed at a hardware store, Ace Hardware in New Orleans, and he had spent his whole time a white business owner. It's like a Spike Lee Do the Right Thing movie. He owned this white guy owned the hardware store, and he served the black community. He was the hardware dealer for the black community. And suddenly, one day, he sat there with his shotgun, and some of his favorite customers had busted in and were stealing all of his drills. Held him at shotgun, they wrestled, and one of these African-American guys took his gun away from him, and it was a real shuffle. And the white guy said, why are you doing this to me? Why are you stealing all my stuff? I've been in your community for the... And the African-American fellow said, because it's our time now. So there's racial tensions that were there. I've written about Ruby Bridges. You want to see an architectural historic site for design of New Orleans? Go to Ruby Bridges School, France Elementary. Whereas a little black girl, when you had post-Brown versus Topeka in 54, by 1960, they're starting to integrate New Orleans public schools. She had so many death threats for being a black girl going to the white school that she had to go have guards bring her to school every day. And every white family fled, and Ruby had a year of being her own teacher, the only student, because no white would go to school with her. Famously, Norman Rockwell painted it on his painting of people throwing tomatoes at Ruby. The Ruby Bridges, John Steinbeck wrote about it. He was there when she was being harassed in his great book, Travels with Charlie, which is about to have its 50th anniversary, Steinbeck's Road book. Robert Coles, the child psychiatrist, wrote about the Ruby Bridge, big civil rights person. And she integrated New Orleans on the move. Right, the school, France Elementary, is right where Plessy vs. Ferguson took place. So this was 60s America on the move. It's boarded up, France Elementary. And it got boarded up pre-Katrina because no whites wanted to go there. And the state legislature of Louisiana starved the school system of New Orleans because it's largely black city and they want to keep the money into the white communities of Louisiana. Politics played a difference. You go to France Elementary School now, they can get anything, chalk, anything. It starved it. The education system of the city of New Orleans was operating on about a 0 at the time of Katrina. You have a charter school movement there now, which is tracking some. And it might end up being a good thing. And it's too premature to cast serious judgment on it. All I'm suggesting is in a disaster like Hurricane Katrina, and you're talking about 5 years later, where they're still living in it now because they're not 5-year-old problems. Racism's as old as America. Ageism. You want a bit of advice from the historian? If you send one of your parents to a senior home, read the fine print. You know? They got all over Louisiana, people left, loved ones, you think they're being taken care of. Not if the hurricane comes, they flee and they leave them there to die. And you really, truly make sure when you're putting somebody in one of those facilities that you check into what the regulations for emergencies are. Because people died, many people died living in these senior homes. We're talking about stigma of poor people. Do you know none of the police people, they would stand in uniform and wouldn't get in the water because they didn't want to, get their uniforms dirty. And this is black and white police. said that they called the people that were poor that got stuck there fire ants. One cop said to me, I'm not losing my ding-a-ling over fire ants because they're afraid to walk in the water that it's toxic. Nobody knew what was in that water. Do you want to go in there and pick up some disease, some crud, there was rumors that, why are people so afraid of the water in New Orleans? Because the Louisiana politicians have sold it out as a Superfund dumping site for toxic waste surrounding the city. So who knows what's washing around in that water? You know, and it's one of the reasons in Houston you can have a lot of monuments here from the virtues of the Gulf Shore oil, and Gulf oil coming in, the petroleum capital and the petroleum club. But the money never stayed in Louisiana. People made money off of Louisiana and brought the money to Texas for the schools and museums. That infrastructure money never stayed in the town. Want me to say something positive about America's Fortune 500 companies? I wish New Orleans had a bunch of them. Minneapolis, St. Paul has about 23 Fortune 500 companies, been in the year 23, 24. 23. Same river Steve Ambrose and I travel. Minneapolis, St. Paul, 23. New Orleans, Entergy, 1. 23 to 1. There is no private sector money in New Orleans. The city's bankrupt. How does the city exist? Two big industries: tourism and riverport traffic. Good news, river traffic on the Mississippi River, it didn't breach its about Katrina numbers, meaning it's healed. So the Port of New Orleans is up and running. And that's good for the city of New Orleans. Tourism's down, but the city has shown a vibrant, almost inbred boosterism to continue to come on down and have a hurricane. Let's have a good old time. It's like Las Vegas. You do what you want in the French Quarter and don't tell your friends. And the booze flows all night and they're drive-ins, daiquiri shops, and it's a party city and it's a lot of fun. And they're not lying when they tell you it's the single best cuisine in the United States. And so the tourism is fought its way back into being viable. The best thing anybody can do if you have an opportunity is send your groups there. Go there and spend money. Invite companies. Continue to make it a conference center. It needs that tourist money desperately to be viable. But by being below sea level, having disappearing wetlands, having Lego levees, having the murder capital of the world, and it's not attracting corporate people. There is a New South, and you're living it here in Houston, and we live it in Austin. They live it in Memphis with Federal Express, and they live it in Walmart in Arkansas, and they're living it in Charlotte as the banking capital, and Atlanta with Home Depot and Coca-Cola, and go on and on. But there's no New South going on in New Orleans. It's not a banking. The state of Louisiana has acted as politicians as a third-rate banana republic where people come in, extract things, and go. Drop some dough at Commander's, have a couple of drinks, party, say it's great, and bring all the capital out of the state. And so it's becoming it's an isolated city. It's a blue bubble New Orleans in a state that's turning very red because the boom areas in Louisiana are Baton Rouge and Shreveport right now. And New Orleans is being lost to fend on its own. What does it mean? Guys, our country, we got to take care of it. We all love the country. New Orleans is one of our great cities. San Francisco had an earthquake and it went flat in 1906 and it's been rebuilt as a better city. Chicago had a fire and burned it down. New Orleans has needed the attention of the nation, not in a nickel and dime way, but in a way of really working on wetlands restoration on the Gulf. It is not a slight issue, the wetlands. It's not feel good, but the price tag is so high and we are a country in debt and everybody wants part of the kitty. And it's very hard to convince Wisconsin Senator or a senator from Arizona that all this tax money should go in to help one state of Louisiana. I've been arguing we need to do it because Louisiana, and New Orleans is not Louisiana, and it's not a state. It's a multicultural American city of immense importance, such as San Antonio or Boston, and we've got to rally to it. Because if we are a nation right now in ghastly decline, if we're starting to fail as a country, historians 100 and 200 years now will look at the way the country abandoned New Orleans at its time of peril, that they didn't put the infrastructure. And it's not that money doesn't come in there from the federal government, it does. There is some bright signs. The money's being well spent, but it's nowhere near enough. And eventually, you've got to make really, really tough decisions. And part of it is somehow, with these offshore fields of oil, money's got to stay into Louisiana the way it does when they drill up in Alaska. Alaskans get checks. Alaskans are part of the oil industry. Louisiana's got to get politicians that don't take bribes. And, you know, it started. The feds have come in and have cleaned up New Orleans. Bill Jefferson, the congressman of New Orleans, is in, you know, he's been arrested for the famous freezer money, which was the tip of the iceberg. You know, you've got, you know, Edwin Edwards has gone to jail. And it's not that people aren't looking to get rid of bad operators down there. It's just been going on for so long, it's taking time. And I think you're getting a new generation of politicians on the up and up. They're under increased federal scrutiny. And they've got to start working, finding a way here to start fixing the wetlands. The BP spill was another hit. But it's and the state is in some ways below I-10 in Louisiana. That ragged boot heel is in the worst spot of any geographical location in the United States. It's suffering down there. It's disappearing into the sea. Some people will say, hey, that's world history. Move to Baton Rouge, move upriver. You know, what can you do? We're not going to be able to fix it. I think we can save New Orleans, but we can't forget it. And the reason I came, and I'm literally on my book tour for my book on Alaska, but the Rice School of Design, and when I saw that this alliance is doing Remembering New Orleans here, and there's a full house here like this, and are going to be coming to these lectures on the city, and you're a neighboring city, it's very heartening. And the reason you all care about New Orleans is because you love it. You've either visited there, you've traveled there, you know that its culture is so amazingly unique. It's the birthplace of jazz and the ideas of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and it's where Truman Capote and Tennessee Williams and Lillian Hellman, I mean, we can Jelly Roll Morton, I mean, you know, we can go on and on. It's us. It's America. And it's where the Louisiana Purchase Transfer Agreement took place. It's where we beat the British in the War of 1812. We are defending the city of New Orleans. We got to defend it now. And the most somebody like myself can do is to write about it and talk about it. But the most you can do is go. Go visit. Take a weekend. Spend some money. You know, don't lie about it. When you go there, the boosterism is so intense because everybody wants to say, "Come on back." You know, if your whole income is tourism, you're not really going to say, "Oh, hey, did you know we're the murder capital and 3/4 of our neighborhoods are still bombed out and we've got more abandoned buildings than anywhere in the country?" No, you do white lie or booster lies. You know, and you kind of don't look out the window. We're getting you to the hotel and you can be in the French Quarter and you won't even know. But we do know. And we can see the abandoned neighborhoods. And we could see what it was like a bomb dropped, an apocalyptic scenario for the Gulf South. And we are having to deal with questions of climate coming up, living on the Gulf Coast. Is it viable? We have to really rethink a lot of things. What's really going on? This climate issue, global warming, serious to talk about. We don't want to sweep it under the rug. Yes, and if people want to argue over science, it's fine. I'm just telling you, I've talked to all the leading people, and it gets warmer in the Gulf of Mexico. It's warmer. Pick your reason why. But it's the possibility of increased cyclonic activity is possible. And as you know, Galveston hurricane a couple of years ago, I mean, it was felt here in Houston. Houston is not immune to it. And that was not a big one. I mean, you know, this is, remember, Katrina's a Category 3 storm. Category not 5. And so we've got to all pay attention. And in this wonderful city, let's see what we can do here with Galveston. I look at ways to try to protect some of the beaches there right now. Create a Houston wilderness, where there's a group called Houston Wilderness, and find ways to work with the land here. Make clear evacuation plans. You know, how can we do better? I don't have easy answers. All I can tell you from being a historian is not talking about it's not a good idea. I mean, ask your therapist. Keeping it bottled up is not the way to go. If we're having a problem here in Houston and Galveston's hurting, and let's talk about ideas on how, and it's going on now, but it's not that it's time for people to be community concerned, not worried about making personal profits before the disaster and ignoring what's going on here. There's many things that we can do here to protect this great city. Thank you. People need to go, and otherwise I'll answer some questions if there are any. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, we just got back from New Orleans. It's the first time I've been in several years. My sister and I just got back here last week, actually. Our nephew is in the Coast Guard, and so thank you.
Hey.
Yes. He's actually there working on the bridge petroleum thing. All the government services were brought in to go to the whole hotel there. I'm sure that helped the economy a little bit. And he's actually like an accountant, you know, going to the auditing all the supplies and everything. So that's what he's there for. And we went to visit him. And when we were coming, and I took her over to where the levees broke. I wanted to show her. My husband and I have a business that we lost, we were in New Orleans, and we lost several of our people there. One of them died right after. And we also lost pretty much all of the businesses. Obviously, because we had a lot of business. And so, and a lot of them did move here to Houston. But one of the things that what I wanted to ask is, when we were going around to all these places, and I was walking, you know, down the streets, taking, you know, we were walking from the French Quarter and going down to the hotels. And we drove out, was it Mechanics? We drove out Mechanics. We passed the Whole Foods. And to me, it did look like there is an infrastructure there. It did look absolutely, I thought it was wonderful. And we went over to where the Ninth Ward. I mean, we drove right over. The Army Corps of Engineers were still working there. And we drove right over past, you know, like Pontchartrain where the Levees broke. And it looked really good.
Well, Levees broke 3 different places. The huge area of New Orleans East is just a blackout zone. Whole Foods on Magazine Avenue that's the part that I'm saying is above sea level. That's the Garden District in Uptown, and they're still attracting tourists and are doing quite well. Particularly the block where Whole Foods is there is humming. My wife used to own a clothing store on that very block, and it's one of the better areas. I'm talking about these poverty pockets all over, not that part of New Orleans. And so that's why I was saying there are 2 different places. That's above sea level where Whole Foods is. It's not below sea level. And that's why it looks so good. And that's where tourists go. And it's a kind of out of sight, out of mind. If you go to the other areas, I just came back with Congressman John Lewis. We went to all of them over there. And it would shock you to see miles and miles of abandoned buildings. It has more abandoned buildings than any place, anywhere. It is in New Orleans right now. And in fact, there was a fire over Christmas. A bunch of people, homeless squatters, died in one. So the question becomes a neighborhood by neighborhood discussion on what you can do for any particular given neighborhood. Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, the question regarding rebuilding the lower ninth versus turning it into a park or something where flood water can go? Because it's going to flood again. Where do you come down on that?
I don't. It's a hard question. I'm not. If I had answers for the world, it's really a hard. What you said is exactly right. It's going to flood again. It's very. What do you do? And I don't mean to say when I say banks and insurance companies won't cover because no, it's going to flood again. And yet the burden is on people that lost the home. So it's a complex. You either got to pour infrastructure money into a new levee system, or hard choices have to be made on neighborhoods. But the people deserve honesty about it. And government has copped out and has put the burden on the victim. Hey, come back if you want. Well, if there's no infrastructure, you can't really come back. And it's because no politician wanted to say it. If you say, don't come back, you'd infuriate the African-American community and the left in particular in an unbelievable way. So starting with the Bush crowd, it's been kind of make your own decisions. We're not going to deal with it. And it's disillusioned the people that go to work the lower ninth ward because all these volunteers come ready to work. And after a few days, they realize there's nobody else helping us. It's our little group. And the problem with the levees, they fixed the 3, but they're in the 9th ward. These look like the bad highway dividers in Los Angeles. And this is over 300 miles of levee system. We're not just talking about one. And as I said, the Mississippi River levee is fine. So these urban policy planning decisions have to be made. And I think they need to be made soon. Maybe they are being made. Paul Nitze, Harry Truman's great advisor and the creator of National Security Document 68, which put America on a permanent wartime footing, once wrote an introduction to a book of mine on Secretary of State Dean Acheson. He's dead now, but he has the Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. And he had been in all these government things. And he told me, the problem with you historians, you're always looking for your documents. It's like, well, what do you mean? He said, don't you understand the inaction is often the policy? I remembered that. And it came in useful when you're seeing a neighborhood that's not being fixed or touched, but there's no policy. It's like, hey, come back if you want to. A decision's been made that it's not a good bet to rebuild that community, but the people that own a home there and want to come back there not being talked to straight. There's not a lot of straight shooting coming from anybody because nobody likes in politics to be the bad news, provider. So I think forums like what you're doing here is helpful to discuss some of those neighborhoods. And you touched on tough. Just what you said, you make that a grasslands place to make it the flood and open it up there. Problem is you've got Jackson Barracks just got a lot of government money there and they rebuilt that, and you have projects like Brad Pitt's project keeping things going, so there's enough viability of a community there that, and those people, that if it's good enough for the government to do the Jackson Barracks argument is why can't we build a community? I had me here for 15 years of Katrina. I don't feel it's going to be a flourishing, viable neighborhood with schools, safety, etc. It may be flooded, or it may be that Brad Pitt project grows a little and it kind of stays as an architectural, vision. What those guys had to do there is to say, look, and they're wonderful homes, but these are homes of tomorrow. That you can maybe build homes like this below sea level, because the water won't knock them over because of the new kinds of architecture, not just those shotguns that got washed away. Yes?
Well, you talked a lot about Orleans Parish. What about St. Bernard Parish?
Well, St. Bernard's is, and I apologize for that, and it's only, it's only because I was tasked with New Orleans, because, Bay St. Louis and Gulfport and Waveland, but St. Bernard's has taken it really, really hard. It has been double hit with Katrina and the spill, and it's just sad there at St. Bernard's what's happened. No, because there's it's sort of a browbeaten people that the only way to keep community is going with the oil and gas world. Famously during Katrina at St. Bernard's, Murphy Oil had oil tanks which they were supposed to fill with oil, because when you keep the tanks filled with oil, when a storm comes, it's so heavy it won't blow over. and they refused to put them there. They only kept them with half filled. And so when the storm hit those tanks, they blew, and it poured oil all over the people's homes in St. Bernard's Parish too. These are very browbeaten, working class people that aren't getting dealt with fairly by federal, state, or local government because the people come there to make money and strip it. It's third world mentality. Let's go to Indonesia. We're a big company, take what we can, leave havoc, and we can then create an environmental chair in a university. And I love St. Bernard's and hope that there's something to do. Maybe the Jackson Barracks holding it down there and the proximity to oil and gas monies might be able to help that very troubled piece of Louisiana. Yeah.
How is Tulane affected, and the universities? I know that several universities there, but how do they look 5 years?
Well, Tulane has done a very good job under the leadership of Scott Cowan, the president of Tulane, in projecting itself. And I think the university life in New Orleans is particularly Loyola and Tulane, because it's by the Whole Foods, it's up there in the uptown above sea level. It's functioning well, and they've gotten a lot of donor money. They had to close Newcomb College, women's school. They had to shut down sociology departments. It took a hit, but because it didn't get principal flooding, it's still a great American university. If you go 5-10 blocks behind it, it's neighborhoods are still quite in disrepair. But I would suggest if any of you you couldn't do better. I mean, it's a wonderful American institution, and it's done a heroic job of keeping that alive. And New Orleans has a lot of appeal to young people right now, and artists. And so there's an energy in the city that's very defiant and exciting, and Tulane's part of that kind of resurgence or renaissance. Yes?
Early on, you said that the port and the oil field contributed to this, and then you talked a lot about how the port did it, but then you never went back and said why the oil field, other than the Murphy's oil in their tanks. How did you figure that they contributed to this happening?
Because the wetlands have been destroyed by when the Mississippi River got channelized in the 1920s by the Army Corps of Engineers, what they did for big shipping, all of this is the dream of New Orleans of being a saltwater port. Houston is now the great port of the Gulf, but New Orleans wanted to be just the Mississippi River port. But New Orleans is 60 miles from the Gulf. And so the dream is to have make it the international tankers in New Orleans and the Mississippi River, and you have this great port system. Well, when they tried to start doing that, they channelized the Mississippi River, because this is engineering of 1920s, and people didn't understand that we never owned the Mississippi River. To be so arrogant to think that engineering beats nature is you better wake up. And so it couldn't do quick things, but what they did is cut off all of the tributaries going into the Atchafalaya Basin, so it starved the wetlands of its nutrients. And so you have a dying wetlands going on because of the channelizing of the Mississippi River. What we're pushing for right now, the Obama administration, do is open up the floodgates of the Mississippi and put sediment in it, or you're going to lose the oysters, you're going to lose the shrimp, you're going to lose Cajun culture, you're going to lose that. When it's the least expensive human thing we can do now is to help that water come in and replenish the wetlands. And that was all done to make way for the oil industry and the tankers that were supposed to come and use this to bring directly Venezuelan oil could come right up the Mississippi River, and it was engineering boondoggles. Beyond that, the dredging that's gone on in other parts down there is just wreaked havoc on it. This would not happen off the coast of Washington or Oregon or California, where they have active conservation environmental communities. New Orleans and Louisianans fake it. When you go to New Orleans, it's garbage. They're cleaning it now, but people used to throw their cups on the ground, throw this on the ground. And if you're not a good land custodian, and if you say you love New Orleans, and you love your Louisiana, then take care of the land. Because the main thing humans can do is give our children and our children's children the land better than we had it. And Louisiana's not better. It's worse. Every decade we're handing down damaged landscape to our children's children because people there want the quick money, give me the cash in a brown paper bag, and they're not having built the sustainable modern community and funding to come in there. And the oil industry cuts the deals. They don't have to worry about it. It's easy if a state like that, you're a politician, take a bribe and allow toxic dumps to be put into the swamps. It's part of the problem is Arctic tundra, desert, and wetlands were never considered serious landscapes. We celebrated in America monumentalism. You know, the Grand Canyon, Mount McKinley, the largest thing, but a modern sense of ecosystems is fragile ecosystems like wetlands are the aquifer, the lungs for the entire country. I mean, all of the water that's coming down from the Ohio, the Missouri, and so it takes conservation of the wetlands is because you love Louisiana. And you can't have a gouge mentality. I can grab what I can now. And if you do that too much, you're going to get this sort of mayhem where you're deeding your future to industrialism and leaving a blighted place. And people are going to move away. And you're going to be left with a damaged landscape. And unfortunately, that's what's happening. We're losing the wetlands. I better wrap up, guys. Thank you.
Great.